Thank you very much. Welcome. My name is Francisco Veloso. I'm the Dean at Imperial College Business School, and I'm delighted to welcome you all here for an inaugural lecture with Markus Perkmann to share with us some of his thoughts about this very important thing that makes us reflect, especially in academia, which is about the university mission and the boundaries of that university mission. But before getting back to that, which is the topic and the issue that brought us here tonight, I'd like to introduce Markus, and it's really a delight and a pleasure to be introducing Markus tonight. Markus has been doing work, since basically decided to come into a more of academic career in this area of university, tech transfer, the role of university, the relationship between science and the broader society and open innovation, for a long time. And this has been part of his reflection and his journey. And of course, there's been, like in all our careers, some detours and some thinking about what's next. And so effectively, it comes out of Italy, although a part of Italy that some people say that it's not quite Italy because they speak German. So that's kind of this, different part of Italy that's quite at the border of Germany. And, we went to do science and maths and then studied political science in Vienna and actually then moved to the UK in '95. And so that's when he arrived to this country to study sociology in Lancaster, where he worked with Bob Jessop, a very distinguished theorist that looks at precisely the role of the state and in a more sociological context. And that's where he started to do work in these university-industry relations and academic entrepreneurship. And then at the end of that, I guess he had some thoughts about whether or not academia was the right path, and so he moved into the private sector and actually joined a startup, and which is always something that's useful is if you're talking about entrepreneurship to have had that experience. And so very much a precursor on the digital learning, because he joined the e-learning startup back in 2000, and he was the head of innovation and strategy, and that's what brought him to London. So he started to move closer to us, not quite yet here. Then he decided in 2003 that actually academia was his thing, and so he went back to academia, not very far. He went all the way to Warwick, which is not that distant, and he stayed there as a research fellow, working already in this area for a few years, and then in Imperial he joined in 2008 and as a senior research fellow, and David Gann, who's present here, had an important role in bringing him over to the business school, and he's been with the business school since then. He then became an associate professor in 2014, and then a full professor in 2017. And of course, precisely because of his interest in his role, he's been very much an academic leader in this area of industry, university relations, academic entrepreneurship, open innovation. He has over 30 publications in this area. He has more than 9,000 Google sites, and it's been keeping at a good pace. About 1,000 a year are adding up, so it's kind of 9,000 and counting, given the rhythm of adding that's happening. And of course, doing very impactful work that is precisely why he's widely read and appreciated for the work that he does in these areas, in the editorial board of several of the leading journals in the field, and the editor and the co-editor together with Nelson on Innovation, Organization, and Management journal. And beyond being an academic leader in the field, he's also been a very important academic leader quite here at home. At Imperial College, because he's been head of the Department for Innovation and Entrepreneurship. He's been the academic lead in terms of bringing the intellectual element and the research element to the work that the Enterprise Lab and the tech transfer work that's done here at Imperial, which has been very, very important. And he also oversees the entrepreneurial journey at the business school, and more recently, after stepping down from the head of department role, he also agreed to continue his distinguished service role and becoming the the head of our MBA suite of programs, which is, as you can imagine, a very central set of programs for the business school, just like for any business school. And so we're very grateful and delighted for the very impactful role that Markus has had, both in the broader academia, but also, quite importantly here at the business school and with us. It's not only about work. I mean, he's also enjoys sports, in particular mountain. Somebody that was born at the mountain, that's not surprising. Anything from mountain biking, hiking, or running, and that brings us back to where we started, which is to talk about today, and where we're going to talk about the impacts of science on economy and society. And this is quite important because what we see is this increasing pressure over the mission of the university. Sometimes people talk about mission creep, and this is something that actually with the provost that I very much like to acknowledge and thank for joining us tonight, is something that has been quite present about where the boundaries of the university are, our role in terms of tech transfer, which is certainly something that we'll talk about tonight, but other types of roles that we're increasingly being asked the university to play in the context where there's a lot more funding pressure as well. And so this is a very important reflection that gives us the benefit and the pleasure of having Markus here tonight to share his thoughts, his experience, and his ideas about how to think, how to reflect, and how to help us bring our journey forward. So thank you very much delighted to introduce you, and very much looking forward to hear your thoughts. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Francisco, for this very kind introduction. Hello, everybody. I would like to thank you for coming tonight. Before we start off talking about the topic of the evening, like any academic, I have a lot of people that worked with me over the years, and I've tried to find photos for all of them and put them up to thank them for working with me over the past years. I also have two other people to thank, and you can see the mountain theme in the background. My wife, Adrienne, and Lucas, who are here. Thank you for everything, Adrienne. You were instrumental in this. And thank you, Lucas, for being here, even though I can see that you brought Harry Potter just as a backup in case it gets boring. So now I want to start off by talking briefly about the relationship between society and science in a historical perspective. In a sense, it's a relationship that is always historically grown and variable. It hasn't always been the same. So let's just recap very quickly as to how we came to where we stand today with this relationship between, with this contract between science and society. So this is a copy of the first volume of the transactions of the Royal Society, and this was the first scientific journal. It came out in the 17th century. So this is around the time when science in the way we understand it today really emerged as an activity. There were universities before, notably Paris and Bologna as perhaps the oldest institutions, but they were sort of more focusing on skills and knowledge as opposed to science in a sense that we understand it today. So the Royal Society was not a university, it was a club of gentlemen, I believe it was only men at that time, who came together to seek novelty, travel around the world, and write up the research that they conducted. So this is the HMS Beagle, upon which Darwin traveled to Latin America. It took him 5 years to this journey, and He was a geologist and also obviously had the opportunity to study the species and the evolution of the species and collect evidence. Who funded his journey? Dad. It was his dad. His dad paid for his living expenses, even though the Navy allowed him free passage to be on the ship. But his expenses for the journey were borne privately. So at that time, there wasn't a contract between the state and a society and science to pay for science. So, the big picture. So as one of the colleagues, friends of Darwin said, no amount of proficiency in biology will bring any bread and cheese onto the table in those times. So the first serious involvement or emergence of a contract between, let's say, government, society, and science came from Germany. So this is Humboldt University. At that time, it wasn't called Humboldt University, but it was founded around 1810, and it was the first instance of a university where the state explicitly funded professors as civil servants. And hence, this was a new way in which, on a large scale, more systematically, science and education was funded by the state. At the same time, we have the emergence of colleges like Imperial. This is the Royal School of Mines. The business school today is in the building of the Royal School of Mines. Things have changed a little bit. So there was this generation of colleges that were founded by governments, with the help of governments, that were dedicated to using knowledge to solve technical problems. So this was the first time in which, on a larger scale and supported by government, the science was used in order to drive technology, essentially. But at the same time, even in the 19th century in Victorian England, for example, there was a lot of resistance to this, and there were many members of the educated elite who thought it was below the learned kind of culture of learned people to use what was learned for solving practical problems. And so there was a boundary work going on that was trying to define the role of science in society, and that at that point, essentially, it still had to be established that science could be used in order to help technical problems. So this is one example. The other one is this one here, where an observer says all the bridges, the railways, and everything that was being built by Victorian engineers didn't actually need science. They were very capable on their own, and essentially they were saying it didn't have any place in the universities to be taught at universities. So a further chapter was opened in post-war, in the post-war period, with this influential report by this person pictured in time called Vannevar Bush. He was a government functionary and engineer who wrote this report, which is called Science, the Endless Frontier. And this report essentially said the state has the duty to fund basic science, because it's basic science that is the beginning of all technical development and of all solutions to problems of humanity, whether that's disease or taking people to the moon and so on. So this was the post-war consensus that then internationalized, which essentially said it is the state's role to fund science on a large scale and also leave the scientists alone. This was actually encapsulated already in 1918 by by a report called the Haldane Report. Haldane was a British politician, and he chaired a committee, and they brought out a report, and that said it should be peer review that should be used for governing the science system, so that the scientists should govern themselves in their curiosity-driven drive for finding new knowledge. And so this was further institutionalized in post-war America, as well as the other industrializing countries at that time. So in sort of the 1970s and 1980s, a change in the contract occurred. So you've got here information about the Bayh-Dole Act, which is a law enacted by Congress in the US that essentially stated that all inventions that came out of research that was federally funded in the US should belong to the universities at which the research was carried out. And the objective of this was to give incentives to the universities to take ownership of the IP that was generated within their confines and commercialize it. So this is a principle that was first on a large scale implemented from 1980 onwards, and as you will know, it rapidly also was diffused around the world, and a lot of other countries subsequently adopted this principle of the universities owning research and not academics. So that essentially also brought about a development where tech transfer offices were established. So almost all American universities in that decade, in the 80s, established a tech transfer office, and followed by universities in Britain and everywhere else. So where are we today? Well, today we see a broadening of this contract. A broadening in a sense that and we can see this at Imperial as well, we see tech transfer, strictly speaking, embedded in a broader way about thinking commercial engagement and engagement by universities with economy and society. And we have the attempt of research funders in government to say, well, let's define broad missions that we believe or that society believes are important for science to tackle cancer, the environment, technology, interaction of people with technology, and so on. And so perhaps a government can shape the way in which scientific knowledge is developed and hopefully can solve some of these problems in these areas in the near future. So to conclude this very rapid overview, this history of the relationship between science and society, there is also an economic argument for science being funded by government. Does anybody know what this is? Nuclear bomb, which one? So this is the Soviet replica of Fat Man. And I owe this to Jonathan Haskell, this example, a colleague of ours. So this is almost a precise replica of the US first nuclear bomb. The Soviet one was finished in 1949, and so and this one obviously in the early 40s. So this is just to illustrate that knowledge is a public good. Knowledge is a public good in the sense that you can't usually exclude others from consuming it. It travels. Knowledge is something that is very difficult to appropriate by commercial operators. They can do it for some time, but usually it will leak out. And so that, from an economist's viewpoint, that is a reason why why government needs to subsidize basic research, because the private sector systematically underinvests in basic research, and hence maybe few of these problems would be resolved because the public sector, the private sector wouldn't be investing in them. So this is kind of an economic rationale for government to say we need to fund basic research. So the situation we're in historically then is that we have science as a distinct system. So let's look at the sort of features of that system very, very briefly. So across the OECD, science conducted in universities accounts for about 0.41% of GDP. So less than half of a percent. Plus we have a little sliver of further government expenditure on research in government institutions like the MRC institutes and so on. So it's about 0.6% of our GDP across the OECD we spend on basic science conducted at universities and similar institutions. 2 million people work in this sector, and this is including China and Russia. And this compares to an overall figure of about 2.5% that is expended on research and development in the economies as a whole, including the private sector. So R&D is an interesting animal because what is usually called R&D is usually 90% D. So most private companies would spend 90% of their money on development, as opposed to R, which is the preserve of public science and universities. So this is kind of the roughly the order of magnitude of science. Here in the UK, the government spends about 12 billion pounds a year, of which about 7 goes to universities. So that's kind of the order of magnitude. The GDP of the UK is about 2.1 trillion, and this is about 12 billion. Right? So this is kind of just to put things in relation to each other. So sociologically speaking, how should we think of science as a distinct system? So this is kind of the pioneers of studying science as a field of human activity. He's called Robert Merton, and he was an American sociologist, and he wrote this specific piece in the 1940s. So what he said is science is characterized by 4 principles, and this is he called this a normative analysis of science. So these are the values that he said of people operating in science, of the scientists. First, he called it communism. Some people today call it communalism. So essentially, it's the principle that all of the results that come out of science should be open to everybody. And you can see today that government in the UK has decreed that all of our output should be publicly, at least the outputs that are publicly funded should be openly available. So that is actually a principle that is fairly widely practiced. Universalism. So this is about the principle that whatever is found as a research result is independently valid from who puts it forward. Socioeconomic status of the university, whatever. The only thing that counts is the output, and that's judged by itself. That is also something that is a feature of the science system, where it is, despite the stratified nature of academia. If you think of high prestige universities and other universities and so on, actually what is published in journals is actually fairly widely distributed. So people at all kinds of universities across the world at different levels of seniority publish stuff. So this maybe is because there's a universalist approach to research result. Disinterestedness is the principle that, in theory, I should not have a personal interest in being rewarded individually, and organized skepticism. So anybody who's ever been to an academic seminar or has received a review from anonymous reviewers will know what I'm talking about. So these are the principles that are probably not practiced in ideal terms, but roughly characterize the way in which science is practiced as a distinct type of activity that is different from others. So because these principles, for example, do not apply as they are here to private sector R&D, where you have less publishing going on and so on. It also establishes the system as a profession, as a career structure, with that defines what is valued and who has legitimate reasons to be listened to. So that's the science system. So if we sort of take that as a given, science operates as a semi-autonomous system in society. How should we think about impact? So how should we think about the way in which what is produced within the science system has an impact on what is outside of the science system? Because economic activity, education, and other things are all outside. So one way of looking at this is to simply take an aggregate view. So this is about trying to establish when university research is conducted, what can we see as effects? Well, there's lots of effects and benefits. There are lots of byproducts of science that we can narratively observe. One of them is the computer. Here I took a picture from a time where computers still occupied whole rooms or whole buildings. But perhaps not the original invention, but the development of the computer as a tool very much owed very much to the fact that university scientists needed to collect and analyze large-scale data, and they were looking for tools that helped them to do this. So magnetic resonance imaging also is something that originally arose within science because scientists wanted to measure the magnetic moments of the nuclei within the atom. So it came out of a need to do research. But it was also later then generalized to be a very impactful medical tool that had an impact on how we diagnose disease. So these are some of the byproducts of science that make an impact on the outside without necessarily having a scientist to do something. Others are the production of skilled researchers. A lot of postdocs, for example, don't go into academia, but they go into industry and education more generally speaking. So economists have tried to look at, to quantify those impacts, and they've looked at outcomes like industry patents, innovations. They've also looked at productivity. Across all of these studies, what they generally find is a positive effect. So for example, when in one area, so this is a study from the United States, when in one state a certain amount of money is spent on university research, then that has a positive effect on industrial patents in that state. So that can be measured and determined. So all of these aggregate studies show generally a positive effect. But the question is, does this mean, if we think about science as an autonomous system, does this mean that science can just autonomously operate and doesn't have to do anything in order to engender this impact? Well, the answer is no, because there's a lot of additional research that actually goes into into showing how the actual mechanisms work by which this impact occurs. So this is generally known as the channels of impact. So my colleague Alan Hughes and Eamon Salter and colleagues, they have surveyed all of the UK's academics. And I think 20% replied, which is still about 20,000 people. So they have collected very, very good data on the types of interactions that academics have with the outside world. You can see them on here, so they can group into people-based activities, problem solving, commercialization, and community-based activities. So the numbers there and the size of the circle refers to the number of times, the percentage of academics within academia who have engaged in this activity in the last 3 years. So you can see that almost all of them attend conferences and so on. But what is the way in which we should interpret this? Well, I believe that we need to look at sustained interaction as opposed to one-off interactions, because one-off interactions probably don't have that amount of impact compared to sustained ones. So if we try and group those, I would like to essentially group them into two buckets. One is commercialization, and the other one is what I call academic engagement. Commercialization involves people, academics, founding companies, and patenting, and their patents subsequently being licensed. So that's commercialization, strictly speaking. And then academic engagement is a broader term whereby the academics work with industry on contract research, on joint research projects, on consulting, informal advice, sitting on advisory boards, and so on. So let's talk briefly about those two buckets. The first one is commercialization, and here, as an example, you have one of the so-called Cohen-Boyer patents, which laid the foundations for biotech in the 1970s. So this is essentially about recombinant DNA, where the technique was developed to put sections of foreign DNA into bacteria and then express certain proteins. So this commercialization initiative was extraordinarily successful. That's why it's so much talked about. So it was licensed 470 times. It's the basis of thousands of products, and the licensing income was more than $200 million. And on top, a biotech company was founded. So this was one of the examples that you can use for how impactful the commercialization of science can be. However, this is what we have to say is that commercialization outcomes are very highly skewed. So studies in the US show that perhaps 80% of universities make a loss on tech transfer. Only 20% cover their costs from tech transfer, which means 80% don't cover their costs from income from licensing, as well as selling stakes in spin-off companies. Here, I'm showing you some figures on the situation in the UK, which essentially shows that down here, you've got the income of all universities in the UK from this activity, from commercialization, and it's about 200 million pounds, 250, which corresponds to about 1.3 million pounds per university. This compares to an overall turnover of the university sector in the UK of about 38 billion. So commercialization is an activity that can be very successful in, it's like venture capital in some instances, but the system also costs a lot of money to keep running. And the overall output is not necessarily a huge moneymaker for a lot of universities. By contrast, if you compare that with income from contract research, consulting, and other types of income from what I call academic engagement, that's about 1.8 billion. So it's a multiple of what universities receive from commercialization. However, having said this, I'm not arguing that we shouldn't do commercialization. It is still of value to do commercialization for those projects that are of high value, and moreover, engagement and commercialization often goes hand in hand on the individual level. So individuals who engage a lot with industry are also often academic entrepreneurs, and hence they cannot be necessarily cleanly separated. So this is kind of, let's say, the empirical situation about those two types in which impact is achieved. But how about what we know about the potential, about the consequences of those activities for science as an autonomous system? So, in other words, the question is, are those activities good or bad or neutral for the conduct of science, which we have described earlier as this system that operates fairly autonomously on its own? So there are 4 ways in which we can potentially think of drawbacks, of risks involved with impact relevant activities conducted by academics. The first one, it may be bad for their productivity. They may publish less. Secondly, it may skew their research agenda away from basic research questions to more applied research. Thirdly, it may hamper openness in the system, and hence violate the first principle of communalism. And fourthly, there may be an issue of commercial bias. So let's look at these in turn. So on the first one, productivity, with colleagues, I've done a piece of research here at Imperial looking at the entrepreneurial, at the founding of spin-outs. Here at Imperial, we looked at about 10,000 people, and we explored what are the consequences of founding a spin-out. And so essentially what we found is the following. First, we found that academic entrepreneurs subsequently pursued research that was more exploratory. In other words, they went into different fields. So they went out of their narrow disciplines. Secondly, that had a positive effect on the research productivity. So this may suggest that there could be a positive effect of that on research productivity. The other question is, the other way in which you may look at it is to say, does it affect their ability to get grants? Because grants are a leading indicator, a precursor of getting basic research done. So we use the same data to study that. I hope Molly Stevens doesn't mind me putting her on the spot. She's one of our academic entrepreneurs who works with industry a lot. And so the question is, does that damage academics in terms of receiving grants? So what we found is this. And this looks actually worse than it is, because it essentially suggests that academics can get a total of 12 industry contracts over a period of 10 years before there is a negative effect kicking in on their ability to get grants. And this is on the basis of the thinking that grants are allocated by peers, so other scientists, and it may be that as somebody who has an overly excessive involvement with industry may get discounted by the peers, and hence they may not be awarded the grant. But here we can see that for the turning point here is at around 85%. So for 85% of the academics that we studied, that's actually not the case. It's actually a positive. For 85% of academics, it's a positive to work with industry for their standing within the academic peer community. So what about pressure towards applied research? On productivity, we're probably okay. The evidence on the pressure towards applied research shows little. So there's little evidence across various studies that there's an effect to making people shift their research topics towards more applied topics. So we can put a smiley there as well. But what about openness? So we did a survey in 2013 here at Imperial, and we asked people, in the last 3 years, have you delayed publications or have you omitted information? And you can see here for 25% of the people actually did delay publication in order to publish a commercial advantage. So that is quite an interesting empirical result from Imperial. So there's also evidence showing that when knowledge is patented, people academics are waiting with publication, and hence the diffusion of knowledge is a little slower. Overall, the evidence, though, is fairly neutral, even though, let's say, overall, I put there. Sorry, a bit slow. So overall, I put this emoji there, which is not negative, but it's pensive. So it's something to think about. So what about commercial bias? It is well known that in certain areas of science, commercial funding will bias results. But if you think about that, you can think about it in the following way. It's going to be a big issue in areas where the research is about the impact of products on people or the environment. So this is nutrition, this is drugs, this is pollution, and so on. And in those areas, there is many studies that are funded by commercial funders are 3 to 4 times more likely to not find any negative effects of a products compared to others that are publicly funded, right? So there is a commercial bias effect there. However, I put the pensive emoji in parentheses because that is a relatively small part of research. Most research is about upstream. And so if an academic collaborates with a car manufacturer or a pharmaceutical industry on a molecule, there isn't going to be any bias because it wouldn't help the company for there to be any bias because the product just wouldn't work if it wasn't correct. So for a small part of research that is about the consequences of commercial products on other parties, one has to be careful, but overall, it's not necessarily a huge risk. So, where does this leave us? So, if we find science is operating as a system that is publicly funded, there is these impact. These channels that academics use, and the use of those channels has let's say, some slightly negative, some negative repercussions, and some positive ones. Well, in that case, we need to look at the boundary conditions. We look at the conditions under which both systems can work together in a productive way so that positive outcomes are achieved, and none of the systems is hampered in the way they operate. And so I would like to put forward this notion of boundary work, because there are two systems that are or several systems that are interacting, and science needs to interact with the outside world, so to speak, by operating across its boundary. So how should we think about that? Well, on the individual level, it is clear that we, as any individuals, we always operate in different role systems. So that is basic sociology, and in the same way, scientists do this on an everyday basis. So in one role, there are teachers and scholars. In another role, there are entrepreneurs, and that is in per se not an issue. What research has found is that that academics often develop hybrid identities when they're engaging in commercialization, whereby they strive to make their commercial activity compatible with who they are as an academic. So you can sort of think about that as an expansion of their identity, whereby they use their commercial activity to expand their sense as an academic. And here's a little bit of evidence from a study that we did, which is about the motivations. You can see that the scientists here were asked, what is the motive for you to engage with industry? And you can see that most of the items here have actually got to do with research. So academics, almost exclusively, they are very selective when they engage with the commercial world, and they use it as an opportunity, as a productive opportunity to enhance the research that they're doing. That's what we can say about the individual level. And this shows a relative resilience of the science system that is also borne out of this survey that we did here at Imperial, where we asked about all of the academics here at Imperial the question: what is it in your view that the university as an organization is for? And you can see that those three items that are highlighted in yellow are the ones that indicate that for them, in terms of their value system, the operation as a scientist, as a public scientist, is the primary one. So then we go from the individual level to the organizational level. So, and I'd like to highlight two studies that I've done with colleagues. One is of the Structural Genomics Consortium, which is an organization that was funded and founded by pharma and universities and the Wellcome Trust to resolve the structure of human proteins, and a study of university industry centers. So both of these studies are studies of those boundary structures that help scientists to productively interact with the economy. So what did we find? Well, first, the boundary structures, they act as trusted intermediaries. And so let's look at the example of the Structural Genomics Consortium for that. So the consortium operated as a fairly autonomous organization between academia and industry, and was thereby able to serve the interests of both of these principles. So in a way, it's an organization that can operate to maximize two sets of benefits for two types of involved parties. For the academics, obviously, this brought in funding, but it also brought in the opportunity of having research priorities informed by actual needs in the pharmaceutical industry. That is actually one of the achieving impact in general is actually one of the ambitions that scientists have. For the pharma companies involved, what was important for them is obviously access to the science result, but at the same time, they didn't necessarily want to have their strategic priorities disclosed to the world. And so the consortium organization there acted as a trusted intermediary, safeguarding this information and keeping it under locks, so to speak, and making those opportunities available to the academics and have the work done without necessarily having the strategic research priorities disclosed to the rest of the world. So it operated as a trusted intermediary that you can put onto the boundary between science and industry. The second principle is a lot of these collaborations leverage the basic capabilities of what public science is good at. So, for example, you hear industry executives saying there is nobody in industry who can spend 4 years of their life on a bench working on a little product, on a little problem, and that's what most PhD students do. There is no such thing in industry, and at the same time, it's something that is very valuable it can be very valuable for science. So leveraging what is distinct for what public science can do. And the third one is ensure the continued reproduction of science so it can continue to operate. And one of the ways of doing that is by having individuals, I call them ambidextrous individuals, who can speak the language of two or three worlds. And there are individuals like that around, and they will operate at a university, play the role of a scientist, at the same time, in another occasion, play the role of an entrepreneur. So, coming to the conclusion, what can we draw from this? Well, science is a distinct system that operates according to its own logic, and from the evidence that we have, it is actually worth working towards keeping that system intact. And the evidence is also that it is exactly the characteristics of the system as distinct from industry and other sectors that makes it valuable to the other sectors. And that's an additional argument for reproducing it, for keeping it whole. Secondly, really think deeply about how to design these boundary structures. So this has got to do with conflict of interest policies and disclosure policies and so on. Design those boundary structures in a way that the integrity of the science system is maintained. And beyond the remit of this talk, we haven't even started talking about the types of impact of science that are not as easily operationalized or measured compared to commercialization or licensing income and things like that. And so we're talking about innovating medical practice. So the impact of science on practices within the healthcare sector that have certain outcomes. It's very difficult to qualify, but it's undoubtedly there, and it's very important. Secondly, independent expertise. If you listen to the discourse about nutrition and sugar and so on, what would that discourse look like if there wasn't any scientists and any scientific expertise coming to contribute to that discourse. So that's also an aspect of science that is very difficult to quantify, but that we wouldn't want to miss. And finally, science is obviously there for pure inspiration as well. Thank you.
So, thank you very much for this very interesting and thought-provoking presentation. We have an opportunity for a couple of questions from the audience. We have, some microphones, and since we're streaming these, I would appreciate that you talk to the microphone. Here's the first question up here.
Oh, hi. My name is Jan Dahman. I'm an alumnus. Thank you very much for that sweeping overview. There are a couple of, I just want to ask your opinion on a couple of contemporary challenges to academia and science. The first is, what is the responsibility of the scientists in their own system to identify and manage the negative impacts of their science? And what's the role of the university? And the second one, which is affecting all of us, is what is the university's approach? How can it approach the people who do real science? How do they deal with all the fake science that is coming out and tends to have almost equal exposure in the social media and so on? And that must be a real challenge to the real science.
Sure. So on the first question, what's the responsibility? I mean, this is a personal view. My personal view is there should be a high standard in that respect, both on scientists individually as well as on the institutions. And I believe we are making, for example, here at Imperial, we are making efforts for this to be enabled and to make it happen, that we put high standards in this respect. Empirically speaking, I do believe, from my observation, that is probably the case for the very vast majority of scientists, because the ethos of science is one that lends itself, quite naturally to thinking about the wider repercussions. On the second question, it's a question of boundary work. This is like the same kind of boundary work the Victorian defenders or campaigners for a government-funded university system made against religion or against the notion that mechanics doesn't need science. So I don't know whether there should be any specific actions that are in addition to what is already done, which is the continued work of scientists to provide evidence and to continue contributing to the public discourse on this.
Right, there's one.
Markus, thank you very much. That was a wonderful tour of the history of science and how we think about its application. Just a couple of thoughts or questions, particularly about Imperial College, actually, and you touch on it when you talk about the design and governance and the boundary structures. The institutional framing of science these days, is it becoming more savvy at handling these sorts of issues to allow people to have this ambidextrous role? And secondly, I felt perhaps you were missing something about the inbound questions that come from the commercial world that lead to new science. And we see that, for example, in areas like financial services after the economic crisis. We have to ask new questions, and we don't ask those questions if we don't tangle with the world out there. And so how does that work in your model?
So, I mean, on the latter question, I think that that concept is borne out by our finding that academic entrepreneurs conduct science that is more exploratory, that embraces cross-disciplinary thinking, and hence that reflects the fact that commercialization does, to a degree, bring up new questions, right, for those who do it, and hence they use that as an opportunity to do research in new areas. So that's where I can see this coming up. More broadly speaking, if you look at initiatives like the Structural Genomics Consortium, so from me talking to the scientists involved there, the scientists are actually motivated by the fact that they are doing something more important compared to something less important, right? And so that is kind of the Pasteur's quadrant, where scientists want to do basic science, but that's also going to have impact further down the line.
Right. One back there, and then one here, and then I think we'll have to, maybe we'll pick up 2 or 3 because I think we're given the time. Just pick up that.
Thank you, Professor, for what feels like a balanced conversation. Up here, to your left.
Where are we?
There you go.
There, yeah.
So I run a venture firm, and I make it my mission to look for talented academics and support them in their transition to realizing the commercial opportunity that their research can bring. And there is an aspect that I've been looking into around the ethics of commercializing research, and how quickly we jump from research into building solutions that then are difficult to control. Do you feel that within the boundary structure that you mentioned, there should be a more active approach towards setting a framework, an ethical framework for all stakeholders, academic stakeholders and business stakeholders?
Yeah, it's an interesting.
Markus, perhaps we can collect 2 or 3. There was a second question.
I think, yes, my question builds a bit on that. How and who do you think should deal with research misconduct?
Good question.
I don't go ahead, given that these are kind of related.
So on the commercial engagement and the boundaries and ethics, it's to a degree an ethics problem, but not exclusively, and probably not mostly. It's more a problem of having clear rules and boundaries. With others here in the room, I'm on a committee here at Imperial where we look at commercialization and the procedures that we use there, and we constantly try and refine our rules and procedures with respect to conflict of interest, the use of postdocs for projects that may be close to what people do in commercialization and so on. So I believe that explicit putting down rules is a great means of achieving what you're referring to. Obviously, assuming that most people will behave ethically and follow the rules once they're in place. Once they stop doing that, that's a whole different chapter. But putting that rule framework in place. Misconduct, so that's kind of an intra-science problem, as opposed to necessarily like relating to impact. And so there is misconduct, and a lot of it is probably undetected often. For example, in our discipline, management, it's not as easy to detect. But we have not found a better way of dealing with that than self-policing. So that works to a large degree. That works, and if you speak to most people in academia, they have actually quite high standards in terms of the research ethics. But there's always the issue of some people not following the rules.
All right, final question, Fanny. There's one.
Thank you, Marcus. My question is about whether this system of science can survive our current move towards nationalism. I think the issue around 5G at the moment might presage a schism between different systems of science in different countries and being used as a very important geopolitical weapon. So I wonder your views on that.
Yeah, interesting, Mark. My view on this is cautiously positive. And the reason is that looking at the science system, we do observe that it's quite a resilient system that has quite a lot of power in society. For example, in this country, there's little difference between Tories and Labour and any other parties with respect to what they think the right science policy is, and nobody is actually advocating that science should be curtailed in one way or the other. So I believe that there's a good chance that Britain will remain a member of the European science system. That may be an outcome of the negotiations to come. Cautiously optimistic. Secondly, seems to be a big wave of Silicon Valley billionaires to make money available in big foundations for global research that would potentially counter any national drive. And there is extremely strong connections, transatlantic connections between science and the leaders in science, and hence I wouldn't be surprised if there was more integration on the science level compared to what's going on otherwise. But who knows?
Thank you very much. I'd like to invite Professor Nelson Phillips for a vote of thanks and to close it down tonight. Thank you very much.
Okay. Provost Walmsley, Dean Veloso, Marcus, or Professor Perkmann, colleagues from across the college and guests and friends, it's my pleasure to give the vote of thanks this evening. This activity that we're engaged in is one of the very key ceremonies that go on at universities. At universities, we have a set of things that we do to mark transitions. So we have spring graduation, we have PhD vivas, and another one is this, which is the inaugural lectures of our professors, of people who've been accepted into the professorate at the university. And it's really fantastic that you've joined us, and it's always great to come to one of these and to celebrate another member joining us as a professor at Imperial College. So thank you very much for coming. I want to begin, all I'm going to do is say thanks for like 2 minutes, then we'll have drinks, so relax, yeah, okay? I want to take just a second and thank all of the people who made this happen. As you see, sometimes I just show up at these things and all the magic works, and you forget that there's a bunch of people who put lots of work into getting us all signed up, getting the room organized, taking pictures of things. And I'd appreciate if you join me in just a round of applause for all the people across the college that made this work. Thank you. I also want to thank Markus for his speech. I mean, I have a vested interest because I'm also a co-author, so I think his stuff is amazing. But it is actually, I've never seen it presented together. I know about lots of things that he's done, but the stuff he's working on is really critical for us as a university and for society. And he touched on some things that are really, really important about the nature of science, the openness of science, which I think I was thinking about too. Mark's question about the society. I was in the US last week at a big research university where the Dean of Engineering had been called in to talk to senior representatives of the president about what they were going to do about leakage to China of knowledge and information. This is a thing, right? And so this stuff that Markus is working on gives us some of the tools and ideas to fight back against that by saying there's ways to manage this. There's both ethics, structural ways, boundary work that we can do to manage this in a way that allows science to be open, but to be ethical and to fit in and be contributing to the societies in which they're part of. So I think your research really is very important for us in the university, for society as a whole, and now for these international discussions that are going on. So thank you very much for that, and thank you for your speech. The last thing I want to do is get you all to once again, applaud, but not just applaud the people that helped us with this. That's very important. Applaud them, but also just applaud yourself for being here, and also Markus for doing such a nice job. And once you do that, then we can have a drink, all right?